somewhere.
We're out there. Do you think I can get through this without spilling my water? Your face? I'll do my best.
I thought you were joking last night when you said that.
No, we give them away at conferences to advertise that we have sock services. So let's give you a sock. Come to talk to us about our sock.
We thought we were originally like giving out fidget spinners, and then we should everybody else out.
And now they're a hazard. They said kids are getting their fingers stuck in the holes.
Choking
I
on
heard
my
was that
pointer
they're
bears.
flying off and injuring people across the room. That's what I heard.
I don't think necessarily all that's on accident either. So.
Possibly how much?
Okay.
Got it.
Do you know who generated multiple? Does anybody who generated the key? It's loud. You're loud.
Okay, good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you happen to be tuning in to today's streamcast. Regardless of your time zone, I want to welcome you. My name is Stuart Schley. I'm a longtime business journalist who has spent a lot of time covering the cable industry over the years. And my privilege today is to moderate what I think promises to be a really engaging and robust discussion around cybersecurity issues as they affect, influence, and implicate the cable industry. To help me in doing so, I have a great group of industry experts, including representatives from the two largest U.S. cable companies, as well as some of the solution providers who are helping them and others deal with a massive issue around cybercrime and cybersecurity. We're coming to you live from the Cable Center in Denver, Colorado, and momentarily I'll have our panelists introduce themselves. But wanted to take just a moment to make sure I give proper credit to the people who are bringing this event together. Micro Focus, Novacoast, and Beyond Trust, represented ably by their executives at this panel, have invested the time and money and effort and resources to make this webcast happen, so thanks to you guys for doing so. A brief prelude before we introduce. I don't think cybersecurity needs much introduction as a critical and seminal issue of our age, but I just want to make a couple of reference points. In June, as you all know, the world basically convulsed as a terrible ransomware attack was levied on the Eastern European nation of Ukraine. It quickly rippled to other European nations. We had a panel call to prepare for this event last week. As soon as it was over, on my web screen were headlines about Equifax and a tremendous data breach that compromised personal information for up to as many as 1/3 of American adults. Closer to home in the media and communications space, we had, of course, the infamous November of 2014 breach of Sony Pictures, which exposed a lot of private and confidential corporate data. And even now, one of the iconic participants in the cable industry, HBO, is grappling with a ransomware attack that has threatened to devalue some of its cornerstone programming. So there's a lot to talk about. The cable industry in particular has special exposure to these issues, and we're going to understand them much better over the next 90 minutes than I do, and I think a lot of us do today. So let me, going from my left down, just ask our panelists to tell us name, title, and organization, and then we'll begin our discussion.
Nancy DeVue, Executive Director of Security Architecture and Technology Solutions for Comcast.
Maury Haber, Vice President of Technology, Office of the CTO at BeyondTrust.
I'm Paul Anderson. I'm the CEO of Novacoast.
I'm Mary Haynes, Vice President of Network Security Operations for Charter Communications.
I'm Tom Burt. I'm a product manager in the Identity Access and Security portfolio at Microfocus.
I'm Jim Gherkin, Director of Security Services with a focus on identity at Novacoast.
And I'm David Saslov, a sales engineer at Microfocus, concentrating on the identity access and security product line.
So I promised a great group. They are here, and we'll dive right into our subjects today, guys. I wanted to sort of start by inviting our two cable industry executives to talk about security at large and their security organizations in the context of some of the real sort of pressing big picture issues you guys deal with. I was joking earlier that I'm old enough to remember when security in the cable industry meant sending the technician out to trap the HBO signal so it wouldn't get to the guy's house who hadn't paid for it. So we've come a long way in a short time. And Mary, let me start with you. At Charter, why does a security organization exist? What are you out to do? And talk about some of the focal points of your work today.
So why does a security organization exist? If you think about the evolution of security, and you think about 20, 25 years ago, security was just really about granting access to systems and limiting who could get access to our different systems. And it truly, as we've become internet enabled, and our services now are very internet enabled, we have a lot more exposures, just like any other company. What I think is really interesting about our industry is we have a typical corporate enterprise, and we face all the same threats that every other business faces. But at the same time, we provide voice, video, and high-speed internet services. We provide the pipe that all of this malicious and nefarious activity occurs on. And at the same time, we have to make sure that that pipe is always on and available for use for our customers. And so we have to go to extreme measures to make sure that those delivery mechanisms are always being protected at all times. And in some cases, we're dealing with very old legacy equipment that I think when it was built wasn't even meant to have an IP address on it. But now it is IP enabled. It's delivering very real-time services to our customers. And to make sure that our services are always on when the customer needs it, wants it, we have to have a really strong security framework around it. We face the same threats any corporate environment would face. And so that's why I specialize on network security. My team focuses on how do we protect that service delivery network? How do we ensure that no one's high-speed internet's interrupted, no one's video service are interrupted, and that they're getting the channels that they've paid for, et cetera. So we're always dealing with threats. Now, the threats we deal with are a little bit different than a corporate enterprise. I'm very concerned about the impact of DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, for example. We've seen how they impacted a lot of our social websites when they had a managed DNS provider recently, and we saw things like many of our Twitter and New York Times and Facebook and social networks, you couldn't access them. And because they were under a DDoS attack, their DNS infrastructure that was being managed by another company was under attack. Well, I always have to think about how is my DNS protected? How can I make sure that I don't have the next biggest attack attacking my DNS, which could infect my internet services?
Right.
So DDoS is really, really important. Access management is huge. 80% of most of the breaches these days are due to credential theft. Mm-hmm. And so I got to make sure that all of our credentials are properly being managed and controlled, and everyone has least privilege so that no one can get in and do nefarious things. So those two areas are a real big focus for us.
And Nancy, probably some similar concerns. What else would you add to that picture?
Sure, let me take a step back and talk a little bit about organizational responsibilities, right? So our organization really is built to serve the others, right, at Comcast, making sure that we have kind of a servant-style leadership and being able to support everything that we need at Comcast Comcast, whether you're building a microservice in the cloud or you're working on old legacy equipment, right? We have the capabilities to help through the entire life cycle of that piece of software or service or hardware, right, through the system. And we have a federated model at Comcast where our organization is really there to help support. But in the DevOps model, each team is responsible for security. Every person is responsible for security, right? Because everyone needs to be able to be trained, so we have great training programs to help us protect, because one person or one small organization can't go off and protect everything as large as what we have at Comcast, the divisions, right? Everything we have going on in the cloud, everything we have going on in the network, everything we have going on with our backbone, right? So we spend a lot of time doing training. We spend a lot of time talking about, what are the things people should know? How should we help, protect that? Providing tools for the organization. So licensing things like static code analysis tools. So all the dev teams can just come to us and get a free tool, right? They don't have to go out and figure out what they need to use and how to use it. We can just give them a tool, train them up, and they can use it. And then we can work together as a team to figure out, where we should be applying our energy to help prevent some of the things that are coming. Because we know other things, there are more ransomware coming, right? There's more DDoS coming. There's more kinds of other attacks that the bad guys are working on right now. And we need to work together to put the framework together on how we're going to address that and where the hot spots are in the organization, and work with those individual product lines like Xfinity Mobile, Xfinity Home, Xfinity Internet, Xfinity Video, all these things, right, to make sure that we have the right pieces in place, so we have that very clear definition throughout the organization, from everything from how do you define policies all the way through the whole life cycle, all the way to incident response.
I'm glad you brought that up. And you guys talked a lot about network security, but to set up our discussion at large, you also possess 30 million residential customer accounts. Close to 30 million maybe.
That's right.
Mary, right behind you. So there's a lot of personal data that has to be protected as well from a security standpoint. When we talk about cybersecurity, Maury, I'll start with you. We talk about concepts around identity and access or privilege. Can you maybe guys just talk about what those mean and why they are critical in a cable industry context or any enterprise?
Certainly. So the concept of identity is really, as everybody knows, a human being. And it can translate to a wide variety of accounts that you might have. With the cable industry, you're not only dealing with accounts for your own employees, you're dealing with accounts that may be used by your consumers. You're dealing with accounts by your providers, your business providers, your content providers, all of which are going to need different types of provisioning and account control within the industry. That makes it even more difficult because that doesn't mean that you own access to those devices, the services that are being rendered. You're just providing the transport for the content. So identity management of the human to the account spreads out really wide because there's a lot of different technologies and a lot of different services, many of which you don't own or even have licenses to operate. They're somebody else's.
From a sort of a CEO vantage point, Paul, your customers deal with these issues all the time. Talk about access and privilege and how it is part of this swirling mix of cybersecurity concerns.
Well, so when we go and talk to companies about security, one of the things we always say is you have to get your identity infrastructure straight before you even start to look at your security programs. Because if you don't know who the identities are internally that are accessing resources, you're in a lot of trouble. So at least one of the very high profile breaches that you mentioned, we worked on an incident response basis, and most, if not all of that, was executed by an internal employee who had way more privileged access than they should have.
Seriously?
Yeah. So I'd be curious to throw it back to the two executives from the cable industry. How much do you look at the insider threat potentials, not just the DDoS and the stuff from the outside?
Well, let's go with it. I mean, the internal compromise is common across all organizations. How do you sort of grapple with that? Mary, I'll start with you.
It is a major concern, and one of the things we're really trying to drive is, historically when you look at legacy practices, if you owned a system, then you managed who had access to it,
A cable system.
A cable system. Even an internal system or server. And we really have to move away from that and get to where the owner of the system isn't also managing the access to the system.
Right.
That you've got some sort of solution in place where you can centralize that identity management. You can have ways that you can, for people that need privileged access, be able to track and know exactly what they're doing at all times. And up until just recently, and recently I say the last 5 to 10 years, that technology wasn't really there, but it's there now today. So we have a lot more visibility into what people can and cannot do, and that's what's key. And then you've got to have a very objective group who's managing and monitoring that. It's completely separate from the people that are actually doing the access and doing the work. Because, like we said, 80% of the breaches in the last couple of years have been due to poor access management.
Right,
in the end.
so there's a lot more emphasis on the auditing side too now. to see
Absolutely.
who did what, and again, that's all based on identity. So if you're not clear on who is accessing all of your systems, then you're really behind the 8 ball.
It's a checks and balances.
It has to be a corporate thing, because with the changes that all of these organizations are going through, mergers and acquisitions, spinning up partners and tearing down partners, making new relationships, you're bringing in 20, 30,000 new identities on a moment's notice with no preparation, and they need to be functional on day one.
Right.
So you're bringing people in, throwing people out, and how do you control all of that if you don't have that thought from the top down?
From the micro focus standpoint, how do we control all of this? And what are some of the concerns of your clients around identity, and how are they helping or attempting to solve them? Because it seems daunting, I'm going to tell you right now.
Yeah, it is. It can definitely be daunting, and obviously, larger the organization and larger the access base, that's just really more risk at that point, right? And when we talk about identity as a foundation, identity really is a foundation for security. But even more than that, identity in the traditional sense of people accessing both internally and externally as customers, that's growing. I mean, if you look at the human to machine communication, just even over the last year, it's grown by 31%. They're predicting by 2020 that it's going to be 30 to 1, machine to machine communication. So having that good identity in place, that identity management in place, is the foundation for starting, and then building on that with certification, governance, rules behind it, policy-based decisions. Everything else is hugely important. Plus, that also helps you mitigate some of the costs associated with it. It's a big cost, right? Especially when you talk about organizationally. You've got different parts of the organization that are spreading things out there.
And that's why the analysts now are not just talking about identity management anymore, but rather about identity governance and administration of identity. And it all becomes a larger fabric.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it does start with identity governance, right? Because you have to know what you're trying to manage to begin with, right? So on the on the operator side, we've got our customer credentials, right, that we're trying to manage. We have our employee, contractor, and business partner credentials we're trying to manage. And having the right level of access control, right, administration views, revocation, right, for when you need to revoke people's credentials when they leave the company or they're terminated, and making sure that you have clear communication paths on those, especially things like when people leave the company or are terminated. You have to make sure that everything is connected through a centralized repository, right? So you can clearly revoke their credentials so they can't go ahead and get into some tool like Jira or Salesforce, right, because that wasn't hooked in through your corporate system. And so having those tools in place are critical, right, to understanding that. But from a bigger level, just getting those credentials correct to begin with, and making sure you don't have things like social engineering attacks. That's really a huge problem with
Social
credentials.
engineering attacks.
Yes, social engineering attacks, right? So this is how a lot of people try to get into systems. They call in and pretend to be somebody else, right?
A customer, for instance?
A customer
Okay.
or an employee,
Okay.
right? So that's a huge concern, right? And when you look at things like, insider threats, if somebody's trying to do something bad, they can call around and pretend to be somebody else. You always have to verify who you're talking to on the phone, right? Or check out the email address to make sure it's a legitimate
As a
email
very
address.
fundamental operating principle.
That's
like
right. It's
pervasive.
The weakest link is always going to be the individuals within your organization. I mean, you can plan for security, but as you're talking about with personal identity information, you can spoof that. I mean, look back 50 years ago, our spies would kill for the stuff that we give on social media at this point.
That's
Yeah.
true. That's true. But
If
you
I-
know, risk-based access control, right? That is what's really, really important. Is having some risk-based access control in place, because you see the patterns of that person. You can see what's out of pattern. You can see if they're concurrent sessions. If I'm logging in from the United States and China at the same time, something is wrong.
Absolutely,
You
yeah.
know, now people do use Tor. People do surf the internet anonymously. But I think part of the challenge is making sure you really have that locked down. And you can also have customers opt in over time to other things that they would like to make sure their identity is better protected, right? Making sure that we are protecting their identity in their house, protecting their identity on our services, and making sure they're doing things like multi-factor authentication, both on the enterprise and the customer side, so they can get that one-time passcode on their phone, because their phone is with them all the time, and somebody can't just steal their credentials.
That's actually one of the really interesting growth areas for this, is that with traditional identity, we were focused on what's happening in the organization. And the organization tells the employees what they can do.
Mm-hmm.
But now when I'm dealing with customers, the customers are telling me what I can do with their data, right? They set the policy on what I can share, what I can expose. GDPR says you got to delete me if I request that you just vaporize my entire account, my entire record, right? I'm frustrated if I go sign up for a cloud service for my bank or whatnot, and it doesn't ask me for two-factor because I know how weak passwords are. So I'm demanding stuff of them as a customer, and now you need to too, and that's a challenge.
GDPR, the Euro standard for enforcing forgetfulness, I guess, within the
Privacy,
network,
right. Data
privacy
privacy.
enforcement, which may or may not someday rear its head in the U.S. as well, I presume. Let me ask, going from David on in, one of the questions I think is germane to the cable industry. I don't think we're done yet with consolidation, and these two companies have grown by consolidation. Every week you get a new merger about a Goliath corporate combination, but what particular challenges or concerns do company combinations, mergers and acquisitions bring to bear on this marketplace at large?
Well, I mean, the key is leveraging the asset that you've brought into your family or that you've merged with. And if the process of harmonizing the identities and the access policies across the two organizations takes 6 months versus, your competitor just went through the similar M&A with a different competitor and they got their act together within 2
So they have a
months.
competitive advantage?
There's a huge
Yeah.
competitive gap there if you don't get this sort of thing right. And during the due diligence process, I would argue, of the M&A, not after you've inked the deal and
Good point.
started. I mean, we just went through a massive process like that with the HP Enterprise software. And thank goodness, right, we're both security-aware companies,
Right.
vendors, if you will, and so we have a head start on some of that. But if you don't have those policies in place and the training in place on both sides, as Nancy was talking about, you're way
Yeah.
behind the curve.
I mean, it's not, I think, Jim, you're the one who brought it. It's not unique to the cable industry. Consolidation and M&A activity is endemic across all categories. But are there any points you would bring up related to be aware of when you
So
deal with this?
One of the biggest things that I run into is just the timing of it, right? So working with the IT people, the HR people, the customer support teams, they all know that there's this impending merger, and they know there's going to be roughly 10, 30, 90,000 new people to manage, but they're not allowed to ask any questions until it's hit the street.
Yeah.
And they're expected, customer service is important, so they're expected to be functional at 100%
From
level.
day one.
Day one.
Yeah.
So I can't ask any questions, but I have to be up and running in a 12-hour period. And I'll tell you, we've worked with a couple of these vendors, and that's an amazing challenge to
Right.
face, but it's something that you can do if you are building an infrastructure or a set of corporate governance that allows you to be more agile and more flexible in that regard.
I mean, I guess, Tom, the sheer scale of the cable industry makes it a little challenging when you merge companies that together may bring another 5 million residential subscriber accounts. It's a lot of identity to deal with.
Yeah.
It is a lot of identity to deal with, but as to kind of build on and echo what's already been said here, is it comes down to your policies that are in place before that merger happens, right? I mean, if you define good policies for managing your identities, not only management, and when I say management, I'm talking about provisioning, but also managing the policies behind them, who gets access to what. If you've got that in place, it doesn't matter how big the scale is at that point. All you're really doing at that point is pulling in additional identities into your governance
Okay.
world.
Okay.
So if you've got a good strategy moving forward, I think that's where you save a lot of time with the merger and acquisition.
Mary, you've been through this a few
Yes,
times.
I have.
What would you add to that conversation?
So, I tell people this, when Charter Communications acquired Time Warner Cable and Bright House Networks, that was actually my 10th major acquisition or merger that I've been through in my career. And identity management has always been forefront in each of those mergers. And I've seen us be successful, and I've seen us not be successful. And I would say the big difference between the success stories and then the stories that were much more challenging were those companies who put a lot of thought and practice up front prior to the merger date, clearly identifying, okay, where are the authoritative sources of identities for each of these companies? How do we bring this together? What are the tools that we're going to use? What are the services we're going to use to integrate this all together? And have that ready for day one. Because if you don't have that ready for day one or day two, then it creates a lot of confusion just amongst all of the employees and the different systems. So having your identity management practices and principles in place for day one is really, that's where we've seen things go much more successfully. And you start with the employees. Get the employees straight. Figure out who's doing what, who's reporting to what. You have to be sensitive to all the safe harbor laws. But the identity piece can be addressed. And when that's done first, then you'll find everything else, the transition of the systems, the migration of employees, everything else goes much more smoothly. If you wait 6 months or it takes you 6 months into the merger and you're still trying to integrate that, it becomes a real challenge.
I mean, I'm trying to, hopefully this has never happened to you or anybody, but I can imagine when you're a customer service rep, you go to your login screen on morning one and you can't get access to the customer data would be an absolute rock bottom event you want to avoid.
Yeah, well,
one example.
Typically, you'll run dual identities for a period
Is that
of
right?
time,
Okay.
6 months, 12 months, before you retire the old identity. Because that's the last thing you want to do. I mean, one of the fundamental principles in any merger or acquisition is do no harm to your customer. And so we have to be very preventative in our practices, really think through how can I make sure whatever I do doesn't impact my end customer. Because really, most of the goals behind our merger acquisition is to actually create a better customer experience.
It's really Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? I mean, starting with that access is the very first need, and once you build upon that, that's when you start talking about reliability, resilience, and security, and everything else.
But isn't there an interesting problem that you have that some identities should never be merged, never be migrated? For example, I'm an old Bright House customer, but I even have my old Roadrunner address going back years ago. You still have to maintain and provision and decide somewhere along the lines that you're not. And I still log in with an account that's 15 plus years old.
You're probably the last Roadrunner account on the face of the earth.
That's not going to last for much longer. There's a plan to get rid of both of those.
Okay, but when we talk about identity, bringing them together, how do you prioritize them? How do you prioritize, I will not touch this because I really could impact an end user's email from banking, from all the facilities that they use?
It's a much longer tail in the whole process because you're right, you can't affect the customer, and they want to be able to get into their email or get to their internet, and so you do have to do it slowly. You have to do a lot of customer education, prep them that it's coming up. Fortunately, technologies today, things like web browser messaging capabilities, where we can send alerts in real time to the customer and say, hey, we're getting ready to change this. This is going to be changing in a month. It's going to be changing in 2 weeks. It's going to be changing in 5 days. You really have to inform the customer and make them aware. And there's always going to be fallout, and you've got to be prepared for that fallout. It is hard. When I moved to Colorado 4 years ago, I had to give up my Roadrunner account that I'd had for 15 years. It was really hard to let go of that account. That was my identity.
That is your identity. That's
Everybody
exactly
knew
right.
who marybear@kc.rr.com was.
Nancy, it's not just buying other cable operating companies. You guys haven't done so in a while, although it's Thursday, it's still early. Maybe something will happen tomorrow.
right,
But
you never know.
you also buy a lot of behind-the-scenes companies, advertising, enablement, technology providers. And so you have to deal with identity management, security, governance, and good practices on the sort of corporate enterprise side as well, right?
Oh, absolutely we do. And that's always an interesting challenge. And it depends on the deal, right? Because some deals are with M&As are that they operate as separate companies for some period of time, right? And then some of them are integrated right away into Comcast, right, and just become instantly
Right.
Comcast, right? So it just depends on the M&A, but even as you're doing things either whether instantly or longer term, you still have to have a plan, to Mary's point, right? You have to know what you're doing day one. You have to have the plan for the roadmap for retirement, because you can't just shut off people's emails and give them new email addresses day one. You have to go through that process, right? Whether
Sure.
it's starting that process today or starting that process at some point in the future. And it takes about a year, to Mary's point, on how long does it take to get everybody their email addresses switched, all the tools, right, that are using your username and passwords. If you're doing local credential checking versus a centralized repository, a lot of companies we buy are small companies, and they don't have a centralized repository, and even migrating them over to our centralized repository to check credentials, that tool then needs to have a new software upgrade in order to do that, right? And so that takes some time.
We talked a lot about identity. I want to talk, and Paul, I'm going to ask you to bat lead off here about access and privileges. It's hard enough when we're talking about some of the early stage fundamental offerings of the cable industry, but now these guys tell me they're going to start to connect my dishwasher. And I on the way over, I counted how many IP connected devices. We're not a high-tech household, but there's easily a dozen, the Sonos speaker system and the TV Everywhere extensions that Nancy's company offers. But IoT, the Internet of Things, to me, introduces complications that are almost unimaginable. Can you talk about that?
They are. So the explosion of IoT devices is, I know this is talking about the cable industry, but especially in healthcare, has been a big problem.
Yeah.
So most of them were created without security in mind, and kind of retroactively going through the process of identifying the problems in those devices. It is a real big problem, and I don't know how you guys are going to deal with all of these intelligent devices being plugged onto your platform. And I think without proactively, I know there are some government regulations in the works to mandate some security standards to IoT devices in the future. I don't think that's going to even come close to being good enough.
Right, I don't see how, are you talking like an underwriter's laboratory sort of approach to sanctifying devices?
But I think there needs to be somebody on the commercial side of the industry step up and being that kind of sanctioning body for saying these devices have been tested and they're secure and you're free to deploy them.
You can harden those devices, though, and that's kind of the issue, right? I mean, they can harden those individual devices, but it still comes down to a weak point in that chain. And to talk about you guys being the cable that everything runs through, eventually, as these things grow, as these connected things grow, that lends more to the distributed denial of service attacks, right? Because any degradation within there, you tack light bulbs, right? Intelligent light bulbs in office buildings, right? If you start looking at that,
Turn those all into the things that are doing the denial of service attack.
Right.
so the key
From inside.
the key to that, and my point on hardening the individual devices is you've got to have the intelligence behind it to see something, see those anomalies, right? And kind of see that, if the lights are flicking on at 3 o'clock in the morning in an office building, something's going on there.
Yeah. IoT, we could do a whole webinar just on IoT.
Maybe we
right?
will.
We will.
And we just had a great conversation about user identity management. And being able to have a nice hardened device, that would be the panacea, right? That everything that's internet enabled is already hardened. And customers know that it's internet enabled. But that's not the reality. And we talk about standards, but these devices are being created worldwide. If the U.S. creates standards, that has no impact on what's being developed out of China or all these other countries. So to believe that we're going to have hardened devices is unrealistic. So as service providers, we have to prepare and defend our networks. And so identification of the devices is another challenge we're trying to work through. How can we know that, in fact, those 12 devices in your home, do you really want them connecting to the internet? We want you to approve what can and cannot connect to the internet. We want to give our customers some control because in many cases, customers have no idea some of these things are connecting to the internet. They didn't know that their security camera
And it's self-installed
or their
or
DVR
self-provisioned.
machine is talking to the internet, or and is
Right.
being used for a DDoS attack.
Dishwasher?
So we've
Well,
got to, absolutely, so we've got to give
Yeah.
customers more control of
Okay.
what's being connected from their homes. And so we're looking at that, and then we're assuming a lot of the traffic's dirty. So is there a way we could segregate and segment that traffic from normal internet
Okay.
traffic?
Yeah.
Does
Okay.
that fall under net neutrality
Yes,
conversations?
yes.
I know that's a whole
Well, let's
nother
leave it out, and
topic,
let's
but
just talk
yeah,
about
right.
Right.
the practice could be potentially implemented that would help on that front by segregating and isolating bad stuff, bad
Right.
bits, right?
Well, I think that there's also a deeper problem too when we start to talk about the Internet of Things and what these devices are intended to do, right? The discussion is always, and we even had it before, customer service versus security, right? My security hardliners would say, no, when you're doing a merger and acquisition, nobody gets rights and we move people into the new strong system. And clearly the discussion here was we make service and then we clean it up, right? So I'm balancing those two.
Okay.
The Internet of Things is also very much a discussion of, oh, I want users to have a great experience and to do powerful, strong stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Maury's got a great example of running around an office building, yelling out for Alexas and seeing what they'll tell them and what information they'll give them. I've started doing that same thing with smart TVs, right? If I stand
Right.
outside your door and I yell, TV, open the front door, and does the garage door open,
Brilliant.
right? Can I walk in their house? Who's got a Siri phone, right? If I just yell out Siri, it doesn't know who I am, but it'll give me what I want.
Yeah, but an iPhone 10, just if I took your phone and held it from here, will it unlock?
I don't care if it unlocks, if Siri will respond.
There's all sorts of new
How about a
triples that are
photograph in
coming
front
from
of
these
it?
devices.
I hear you.
I think
All
the
sorts
point
of
is,
new
I think
ones.
the point is that security over history has always been a process of clever people finding ways around
Right.
things, followed by good guys figuring out how to make sure the same mistake doesn't happen a second time
Right.
or a third time.
Yeah,
And-
and it's much more complex than that in IoT. You know, I think, you know, part of the challenge, working with the healthcare industry, they have their own IoT initiatives versus the utility companies, right, have their own IoT initiatives.
Versus consumer electronics.
Right. Yes, and every, you know, all these different organizations and industries have their own IoT initiatives, and we have to work with all of them, right? So we have to help protect our customers, right? That's our number one goal, is making sure our customers feel protected. So giving them that, you know, control over what's connecting to the internet out of the house is, you know, one of the first things. Understanding how to identify those. We understand very well it costs manufacturers money, right, to have the type of security in there they really should be having in those types of devices. But somebody's going to have to step up. And if in the meantime, I know we're doing some really fantastic things around blockchains, right? So we're using new technologies like blockchains, right, to help us understand what's in the home, what should be in the home,
Right.
you know, and making sure that we have a digital, you know, fingerprint, if you will, of blockchains to help us identify and manage which devices are behaving well, which ones are not behaving well, making sure our customers understand what's happening, allowing our customers to control that through, you know, some filtering capability that we would give to them, right? And making sure that they would know what's happening with their devices. They probably are not, most customers are not going to care if the refrigerator is DDoSing our network, as long as it's still making their food cold.
As long as
Right.
it doesn't affect everything else in their house,
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
exactly.
They get their feed when they're
Right.
watching it in the
Exactly,
kitchen.
if it's just
Yeah.
coming
Good.
upstream, you know, over to our network, they don't care. But at the same time, we have to be responsible citizens, right, and make sure it would be going through our regular malware detection, right, so we wouldn't be spreading that out to the internet. But they don't really know, and so we have to give them that easy-to-use interface.
Right.
Make sure they feel protected, right, and then also make sure that manufacturers really do start going through some kind of, you know, UL certification, and then obviously that's the right
Hopefully
term.
it becomes a consumer-sensitive issue over time.
It
Doesn't that
does.
become a unique problem for the cable industry? Because you are providing services like home alarms and
Yes.
cameras, but you're also allowing consumer devices of any type from anywhere in the world to be plugged in. So you have that balance of what services I'm offering and how secure they are. We've already seen modern modems and modern routers being supplied by cable industries having backdoors that you guys didn't
Yes.
even know of.
Yep.
Plus, hey, I bought this cool device, I'm plugging it in. So you've got this hard balance of I own it, I can't touch it, or I'm going to provide it and I have to provide all the firmware maintenance. And wow, that vendor's not going to get it to me fast enough.
Yeah, the optimal level of security in that is where the customer doesn't even know it's there. I mean, the
Right.
customer understands that they're secure and they have that sense of
Regardless of the
security.
source.
But Yeah, but it's
Okay.
just there. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
they don't necessarily need to understand all the things that you guys are doing on the back end to make
That's
sure
right.
that everything is working correctly. They just want to make sure it works, right? Comes back to that
That's right.
hierarchy.
And just give them that yes/no button
Yes,
control.
yes.
You know, yes, this can connect to the internet. No, it doesn't.
It's a good starting, but
As long as there's a hover over for what
Yeah.
yes and no mean. let's add some education into that as well. Otherwise, everyone's just going to go yes, like we do with EULAs. Okay, go.
Right.
David from Microfocus, and I've been asked to help re-identify your companies because there's a lot of banter going, which is great. But David from Microfocus introduced the concept of nefarious actors challenging networks and trying to plant malware into systems, and then we kind of play a game of catch-up. I think that's maybe
Whack-a-mole, yeah.
what I took away. And I'll start with Beyond Trust and Maury. Is that the way it works?
A lot of times, yes, it is very much a whack-a-mole reactive process.
Mm-hmm.
But we find with any vertical that security basics are not being adhered to well.
Okay.
And that starts with just the basics of vulnerability assessment. Where am I missing patches? WannaCry could have been prevented or trimmed if many organizations just did the basics of security.
What's
patching.
WannaCry?
WannaCry was the recent ransomware outbreak that affected pretty much worldwide,
Okay.
took down organizations
Okay.
like FedEx and Maersk because they had older systems that were end of life or not patched that were susceptible to the eternal blue worm that
Mhm.
propagated WannaCry.
And it's interesting that WannaCry could have been a lot worse had the hackers been a little bit more intelligent about the way they set up their hack. So we
Agreed.
They're not
actually
perfect
dodged
either.
a big
Yeah.
bullet there
So
as well.
security basics, and then that goes back to Mary's conversation of least privilege. You can't have everybody as an admin. Even for people externally, they should not be full admins. And we saw Argentina Equifax, admin having access to a sensitive database.
Yes.
Least privilege is one of the key models, and then above that is privilege management, above that is identity and access management, and then back to our original
Okay.
discussion of governance. So it starts with the basics that roll up to the top level model that I believe this panel is addressing.
It's
Sorry. Go
No, I
ahead.
was just saying there's an interesting finding from Verizon does a nice annual report on data breach summarization, and they point out that among tactics used by hackers, 81% of hacking-related breaches leveraged either stolen or weak passwords. Now, this sort of blew me away, and it made me very empathetic with our cable industry people because there's a lot of passwords floating out there for authentication of video services. I probably have 4 different, I'm a business customer of yours and a residential customer, but this has got to be a rising concern. What are you doing around password protection and even password sharing, which is sort of semi-illegal, I guess?
Yeah, so like Comcast this year, we implemented two-step verification. So you can go
Okay.
log into my account, turn on two-step verification, and you can get either a text or an email with a 6-digit
Okay.
code coming to your third-party email address.
And I choose whether to embrace that.
Yes, you
capability.
do. You choose.
Okay.
So that way you can help protect yourself. One of the problems that we don't talk about enough on the credentials for username and password is that people use the same username and password over and over and over again. So when companies get breached like Verizon, right, and Facebook and MySpace, and all of the companies that got, there are hundreds of companies that got breached in the last 12 months. Those username and password combinations are out there. So the bad guys take those and they just
Apply it.
They apply it everywhere, right?
Sell
So they
them to
apply
each
it to
other.
Yep.
Comcast and Charter and Verizon and Facebook, and they see where they can get in with that username and password combination. So when you add that second credential or multi-factor authentication on top of that,
Right.
that really renders that username and password useless because they're not going to have access
Okay.
to your phone, right? They're not going to have access to your third-party email. They're not going to have access to your authenticator that you downloaded on your phone.
And is that a session-specific authentication that I've just performed?
It can be. So
Okay.
it really depends architecturally on how you set it up. It can be session specific. It can really be, however the technology groups decide to use it. It can
Okay.
be transactional. It can be, log in once you do the setup process, as long as everything else on your phone has refresh tokens behind the scenes.
Okay.
Then you don't really need to ever log in again because you've got your refresh token. We see
Okay.
activity that's happening on your phone. It's in a risk-based authentication mode, so we know you're using it in a similar location that you normally use it, and there's nothing wrong, right?
Right.
If people lose their phone, they're going to know that within like an hour or something, right? And they're
Because
gonna
of the
call.
behavior attached to that phone sometimes?
that's
And-
right.
and
Or
the
just
hu-
they're missing it, right?
They're
I guess so.
missing it.
Yeah,
Exactly.
right.
But the human aspect of the password reuse is one problem.
Right.
The harder or larger problem, which affects almost all industries as well, is passwords that are reused in our own infrastructure. Every modem, every router, every switch, every
Ah,
database
okay.
having the same admin or similar passwords. So that if one is compromised, leaked, employee leaves, contractor, then lateral movement to those additional systems can occur.
Can I add to that? Because, you know, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I've always been a huge advocate of when devices boot up, whenever software boots up, that you never have hardened credentials anywhere. The very first thing the software should do is ask you to input a credential, make up a credential, just like we do when we sign up for Google
Right.
or Microsoft or Apple or Facebook. We make up our own credentials that we put in there. Right now, most of the time they do force us to have a real email address, and they don't just let us have a username. But the point is that we should be doing that. There should never be admin. When the stuff boots up for the very first time, before it will give you anything else, any of the services for whatever that's, service is, whether it's a back office system or a cable modem or anything else, it should require you to put in a username and password, and then they would all be at least unique.
Well, but you still have people, so you have to augment that system, because many times, over, 15, 20 years, we go in and we go into a system, and the IT administrator has been required to present that credential, but for that organization, that credential is always my super secret password, and that's what IT uses when they build every server, right? And then they leave it or they don't change it, right? Or they're not forced to randomize it so that everyone is
But
different.
this goes back to the best practices of DevOps.
Yep.
You should always change the password 3 times. Test, rollout, production, and then subsequent changes
And regularly,
afterwards.
right, yeah.
Yeah, if you're not doing it at least 3 times during the DevOps process, you're not doing it correctly.
Right.
Simple as that.
We can usually tell who's done an install based upon the password they use when we break in.
And it's,
Yeah.
also very important to note that the situation you described, or that we're all describing here,
Right.
is manifestly unstable
Mhm.
from a long-term perspective. If you look out 5 years or 10 years, anyone with any insight can tell you that passwords are going to play a much smaller role in everything, from DevOps.
They already are.
They already are. And I just signed up for
I
Clear.
disagree.
I just signed up
The-
for Clear, for example, and I have no password in that system. It looks in my eyes, it looks at my thumbprints, and I get into the most secure
Okay.
system that our
Cool.
country knows, which is
Right.
the TSA system.
Right.
I'm through.
But you can never change your fingerprint or your eye if that database is
Right,
And
compromised.
you have to be
Paul-
physically present.
Paul from
So-
Novacoast is
Still a
dying to,
password.
No,
to
that's what I'm
interject
just saying.
here.
That's like our CTO always says that the least secure thing is to use biometrics, because that's being digitized and stored somewhere, and if somebody steals that, you can.
They got your
It's already
fingerprint.
been
Well, it's already been
through
stolen in
OMB.
the OPM.
Yes.
They have
Yes.
my
I think
fingerprints.
the lesson I was trying to point out here is not that passwords themselves are unstable, but any single form of authentication on its
Yeah.
own.
Manifest, you used the word
Exactly.
And the
manifest. Right.
combination of
Fine.
multiple
I agree.
factors is
Right.
what we're going towards, and not one of them needs to be a password that an admin has to remember, or that a dev or a tester or anyone has to remember, because there could be multiple combinations of credentials.
Yeah. As an
Um,
industry, I think we all know passwords don't work.
Okay,
And so how do we create multi-factors?
right.
And I think customers are out now demanding that. I know I demand it.
Yeah.
We used to tell people years back, oh, we'll get a password safe. Most consumers don't even know how to use a password safe. When I tried to explain it to some friends and family, they were confused. So we really have to move away from the passwords,
Okay.
get to multi-factor authentication. It's probably going to include some sort of biometrics. We can't get away from it. We're moving to a
It just
huge
shouldn't be the
facial.
sole source.
But
Correct.
it can,
Nothing
you're
should be the sole
absolutely
source.
right.
Yeah.
You're
Nothing should be
absolutely
the
right.
sole
Well-
And if you do biometrics correctly, you don't ever store in a distributed database, right? So you can use your One Touch on your phone, and it stays in your phone, and it's hashed with something unique from that phone. So if you steal that, it's actually not your fingerprint. It's your fingerprint plus a bunch of other data, randomized together in a cryptographic function so that it's unique. And it would never work anywhere else on any other device in the world, because it's not your fingerprint that it's saving. It's hashing it while it's verifying it with other data.
Still steal the fingerprint.
But the second,
Well, you
but
can
the
steal your
second.
Depends on the
fingerprint
encryption,
off of
I
a
think.
glass,
Yes.
at a party. I mean, that's
But
the
the-
trick for
but I don't know
years,
if you,
right?
I don't know if you read the
I didn't know
Apple
that.
10 announcement, but now
Mhm.
it's not just fingerprint, but it's the device's interaction with the human that it's
Yeah.
actually tracking
Yeah.
to the millisecond, right?
Yeah.
How do I type my name? How do I type a password? There's more potential combinations, basically uncrackable combinations of that than there are fingerprints.
Yeah. I want to introduce a subject that I'm sure it's germane to the cable industry, because it's germane to everyone, but Paul from Novacoast, Maury from Beyond Focus, if you could respond to this.
Beyond trust.
We just had a merger and acquisition.
All right.
You guys
Cool.
Yeah, so we just talked about
Who's,
M&A.
Sway my
Yeah,
fingers.
Who's reporting to who now? Yeah.
Okay, trust, focus, acumen. But email continues to be a delivery vessel for terrible malware that infiltrates systems. And I'm new to this subject, and that sort of surprised me a little bit. I thought we had all gotten a little bit wiser to phishing, but even the Ukraine, I think, ransomware was the vessel of delivery was an email message. Can you talk about the role it continues to play, and maybe tailor the discussion to the cable industry perspective? There's a lot of email flying around out there.
There's a lot of email that's flying out there, and it's not just phishing attacks. Just yesterday, I was working with an organization doing title transfers and financial information for title transfers in an M&A acquisition, some commercial, some personal. And the vehicle of method for transmitting the count numbers and the routing is still email. There is no secure proxy in between. So what ends up happening is a malicious threat actor will hijack the email accounts and just watch it, intercept the email, change the routing information, or hijack the bank account to extract the money before it ever makes the destination.
Okay.
Because email in itself is an unsecure transport. It doesn't matter if it's encrypted
Categorically,
or not.
generically.
Does not.
Yeah.
We rely on it for too much sensitive information, and something as simple as stealing, a title transfer escrow by rerouting it and then walking away occurs all the time. And it's just a bad vehicle for anything sensitive.
Are there remedies, Paul, or do we just have to move beyond email?
There are. I mean, there are tools out there that are helping. But I actually wanted to ask, because I think you brought up social engineering before, and a lot of that social engineering, those attacks come via email. And really the only fix for that is employee training and
Education.
So
Yeah,
I don't see that going away anytime soon.
It's been interesting because at Charter we recently implemented a very robust phishing practice
Right.
to
Okay.
test our employees regularly
That's great.
and
Interesting.
educate them when they fail. And
Pen
it's
testing for humans?
yeah, pen testing for humans.
So embarrassing enough, I failed it once about a month ago.
Yeah.
I got an email that looked like it was from Adobe for an update, and I clicked the
Right.
link, and as soon as
Yeah,
I
well,
clicked
it happens, man.
and then I got alerted from the
easy.
office, you got a bunch of malware on your
And
desktop.
I've always questioned the effectiveness of security awareness, but we've had tremendous success with our regular phishing campaigns that we do on a very regular basis. We've watched the trend go down. So that education's really helping. They're now knowing what to hover over the original address,
Right.
hover over the URL. Does it really look like that company that's trying to reach out to you?
Right.
But for the last 5 years, I've been doing a presentation called The Threat Landscape. What are the top 3 things? And I talk about the ING attacks. And I've been talking about the ING attacks. And when I talk about ING, I'm talking not only phishing, so the email phishing, but the voice phishing, calling you up, the regular social engineering, standing beside you. There's lots of different ways bad actors are getting information from you. It's not just through email. But email is the easiest because email addresses are out there
It's
everywhere.
anonymous.
Well-
Because old school would be putting on a policeman's uniform or a janitor's uniform.
Uh-huh.
Doing it through email, you're less likely to get caught. If you don't succeed, you try again.
Well, like we talked about in a previous conversation, and I think you brought it up, was it flows like water, right? I mean, they're going to take the easiest approach.
Right.
And that's, honestly, I mean, there's some very clever actors out there that are coming up with some amazing threats. But
Right.
at the same time, the bulk of them are going to take the easiest approach.
I-
If I can send out 12 million emails for $100, and even one person bites, and I get $10,000, great ROI.
Yeah. And I mean, to Tom's point, can we talk a little bit about where our audience is I think, largely a cable industry audience at a C-level sort of area. What organization, this used to be the province of, I think, or the cliched view of a hacker is a lone individual in his underwear in the basement trying to mess with networks and systems. But this is really
TMI.
become a much more organized, syndicated, if you will. The people are really good at what they do now. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely.
Whole warehouses of people sending out these emails
Yeah.
to
But it's
the world,
structured.
calling people. Yeah.
It's
Structured, that's what I'm getting
So
at.
you end up having different tiers of expertise. You'll have the average Joe sending out the emails, and when he thinks he's got a bite, he calls over a supervisor. He calls over another tier of threat actor in that warehouse to basically go, look, I've got something in here, I have access to a system. And then you see the sophistication of the commands the lateral movement,
Yep.
and techniques to steal privileges, because after all, if you have privileges to an identity, you have access.
You're good.
Therefore, basically turning it into a business.
Yeah, it's call centers for
Right.
hacking,
That's
basically.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
They'll even
exactly,
take
it's
your
many-
credit card.
Many of the same
Yeah.
businesses or the same services that you consume
Mhm.
as a business, they consume.
Yep.
So there's lead generation and opportunity generation. There is data stores where you can do research, right?
Yes.
I know that my credentials were stored in a database and sold off left and right, and
Okay.
great. There are transactions, right? I can go do my dark web Bitcoin stuff,
Yes.
and there's a bank that will service my
Right.
illicit money, right? All of those same services that we consume as a business, they have built up
This
as
is
well.
Jim Gergen from Novacoast. His identity's out there. If we want it, we can find it.
I think it
Absolutely.
on two-factor.
He was the guy in
How,
the basement. Wait a minute.
Yeah, well, I am the guy in the basement.
And
I'm
just-
also Peggy from tech support.
But it's important to note that these organizations, and I should also include foreign governments
Yeah,
to some
right.
extent in that,
Right.
these organizations are after ROI just like the rest of us are
They're,
after
they're
ROI.
businesses.
And there are some very essential things such as training of employees, but also some technological advances that can be deployed to lessen the impression of ROI from your organization.
Right.
Both kicking the initial intrusion down the street a little ways,
Mm-hmm.
and then minimizing the amount of value through compartmentalization, least privilege that any given hacker is going to get out of you, and eventually they go
They
away.
lose
Eventually
interest.
they go to the next guy.
That's
I
right.
think, and that's kind of what we've kind of been dancing around this entire time, is establishing that identity as a foundation and having tools in place to have the intelligence to see when these types of things are happening
Yeah.
are crucial to mitigating these types of risks, right? Because if we all know that there's going to be hacks. I mean, you can train everybody in your organizations as much as possible, but having the intelligence to see, you know, these anomalies, what's happening, that's where you actually have the biggest bang for your buck.
Yeah,
So-
because it's not
okay.
if, it's when,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of
Absolutely.
when and getting your response down. What are you going to do for containment and then remediation?
This is where we do the knock on wood thing, because Mary and Nancy, we haven't had, to my knowledge, a Sony-esque or even an HBO-esque high-profile public compromise of a large U.S. cable company. Maybe we have, and I don't know about it, but let's hope we don't. But can you give us a sense for how constant the intent is? For instance, while we were talking, is there a DDoS invasion happening over the Charter network? Or, I mean, what's the prevalence or the incidence of what you face?
see thousands and thousands of DDoS attacks every day.
Every day.
Not targeted at us, because of course the bad guys need our network to do the
This
things
is
they
true.
need to do,
This is
right?
true.
But we see thousands of attacks against our customers, and in most cases, even the people conducting the attack don't even know what they're doing as a DDoS attack. It may be a gamer who's trying to boot off Joe over there because Joe's beating him in the game, and he found this tool on the internet or YouTube
him a
that he
competitive
knows that
advantage.
can boot him off the game.
him down.
Right.
It's a DDoS attack. He's
Okay.
launching a DDoS attack against Joe. And so we see those things every single day. The number of botnets that are coming out on a daily basis. You know, one of the things we've committed to doing as ISPs, large ISPs, is help educate and eradicate these botnets that are out there. And so we see new botnets every single day. And when we reach out to the customers to educate them of, you know, hey, you can go to our website and download this anti-bot software, most customers have no idea they're infected with any of this stuff.
Yeah.
Their antivirus software, oh, I run antivirus every day, but it wasn't detecting it. So we have a huge responsibility in educating our customers and helping get rid of a lot of this stuff off the network.
And as you pointed out, rightly so, kudos for the job that you guys are doing, right? Because,
Yeah.
I mean,
We defend off a lot. Like
Yeah.
we said, as
That's
an
right.
internet service provider, everything across the world comes across the internet, right?
Comes
into
across
the
our
network.
pipe.
So, you know, to add to that, you know, we do also offer free antivirus to our customers. They can just go download
Aware of
it.
that. Right.
And
Right.
so we do give them the tools. We also give them the education. We also send them letters and remind them that they haven't done that if we see attacks coming out of their home, right? You know, and we're happy to give them tech support and wherever else they need, because it's a large problem, right? And we're being a responsible company
Absolutely.
and responsible
Okay.
internet service provider.
But what seems daunting to me, and the company I will no longer call Beyond Focus, but Beyond Trust. I watched a video
I
from
kinda like Beyond
one of your.
Can't have it.
What's beyond what's
First.
beyond
Okay.
focus? An individual from your company was on stage in Europe recently and talked about trying to find some way to start, to come to consensus within an organization about what are the crown jewels, was the term used. Because this is pervasive, as you pointed out earlier. Security touches every single activity you do, but would you have any advice for a company that's a participant in the telecommunications industry, for instance? What are the crown jewels? What are the most valuable assets we need to protect? For HBO, I presume it's Game of Thrones,
Content.
you know, but what is it for a cable company?
So the crown jewels for a cable company is anything that has value outside of the organization.
Okay.
Whether that is content that's not released or could be monetized in terms of streaming services later, client information or employee information, anything that you could think of is if I had it out there, could I sell it or could it get me in trouble from a regulatory perspective?
Okay.
And that second piece is very important because if it's out there in the wild, what kind of fines and penalties could I be subjected to? Now, sometimes just doing it is worth the risk of the fine because the fine is not anything, and the cost to secure it correctly might be too high, not necessarily for cable industry, but for a lot of other industries. The hard part here is discovering the data. Where does it live? Is it on your laptop? Is it in a server? Is it in a properly structured database? Is it secured in the proper database? Nancy mentioned blockchains. It's a great new technology that's evolving from originally being used for Bitcoin, but there are very few security tools to encompass and protect and ensure it. And there are a lot of very high-level theoretical vulnerabilities and exploits that occur against blockchains. So far, outside of owning 51% of the controllers in the blockchain is the only viable approach. So knowing where the threats are or the data is going to be fundamentally key to protecting it, then wrapping your identity solutions around it to make sure only the trusted identities get to it, and then ultimately determining if one of those identities is compromised, because that's why we're here.
At Novacoast, Paul, do you counsel your clients on, in terms of a starting point or a focal point, protecting the crown jewels, or how do you begin to implement thought around security and governance?
So we do, but a lot of it, we haven't talked about it much here yet, is the people side of the equation. So the tools are invaluable and everybody has them. Most companies have too many tools that aren't implemented correctly for the vast majority of the organizations that we run across. So we try to get people to focus back on people and process rather than looking so much at the tool set that they're using or contemplating acquiring. And I'm sure it's a challenge. We talked about it earlier for you guys, that talent acquisition, talent retention inside your organizations, it's a huge problem for all of us. There's a lack of security engineers in the world, and they're not just floating around for people to pick up. So a lot of times we'll advise customers, look to outsource that kind of thing where you can do a managed service offering, and try to lessen the load on internal staff because they're just hard to keep.
You guys, I've noticed in some of your literature, you call security management a culture shift as much as it is a application of tool sets. I think it's kind of what you're getting at.
It's more people and process related than it is back to the specific tool that's being utilized.
Mary, is that consistent with your perspective?
I absolutely do believe it's all about culture. And having worked in a few different companies over the last 10, 15 years, you can feel and taste that culture. It starts with the top down. Is the message being delivered from the top down that security is important?
Right.
When I've seen it in companies where it's being driven up, it's much less successful. But if your top leadership is enforcing, I won't tolerate risk exceptions.
Right.
You got to get this secure, and you've got to get it secure now. And everybody's hearing that message and watching that happening, and they're seeing projects getting delayed because there's a security issue. That sends a really strong message to the entire business. I'd like to, though, go back to your crown jewel question.
Please go back to the crown jewel question,
So
Mary.
that's always an interesting question. And in our industry and in the telecom industry, what is our crown jewels? And I've always said we've got two real important crown jewels. One is the services we deliver. That is our business. Being able to deliver, on-demand, high-speed internet, video, and voice services when the customer picks up the phone, turns on their TV, or turns on their laptop or whatever device they're using for the internet. And so a crown jewel is typically what is your core business. And so for Charter and probably most of our peers, our crown jewels is that service delivery network and those services we provide. But it's also all of our customer data.
Yeah.
And, you know, at Charter, I have the benefit that I have an IT counterpart who owns and controls all my customer data. So I don't have to, I can share the burden
Yeah.
of the crown jewels. You know, he's responsible for protecting that customer data, while I'm responsible for protecting those services. So it's not just a unit, it's those services that is the purpose of our business. If a customer can't use the internet, they're not going to pay us and we don't have a business.
Right.
Fair enough. When you
So-
talk about crown jewels, one of the things that I go into organizations that have no experience with any of these topics, I ask them what would be considered a game over event. What information within your organization, if lost, compromised, would actually close your doors? And for your case, it would be your services that you deliver.
It's our services we deliver. We've become immune to data breaches. You know, I think all of us have gotten 5, 10 letters saying your data has been breached, and consumers are becoming very immune to that.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
okay. Well, I already had
Immune.
my finger.
You're third on the list.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You know, I've already had my fingerprints breached.
Yeah,
So,
there's
you know,
not
what
much
else
else.
can be breached at this
Right.
point in time? And so, you know, initially, you know, 10 years ago, when you had a data breach, you saw an impact to your stock price. We're not seeing that anymore. But if I can't give them Equifax, I actually think Equifax is going to be a game changer. I think that's probably the biggest game changer we've seen in 10 years. People always say the Sony breach was a game changer. But this is really going to make everyone step back and say, how much data should a company be able to store and how long should they be able to store it for? And I think it's going to drive some really interesting views going forward, because this is the biggest breach we've ever had.
Yeah, and the Equifax breach is interesting because we treat our social security numbers like they're authentication mechanisms, and they're not. They're identifiers, right? Just like your phone number, your email address. They really shouldn't be secret. What we should have is some kind of chip and pin system behind that social security number that would then secure the number to your as your identifier, right? But then it's really the chip and it's really the pin that's the secret, right? And only you can use that
Right.
number, and somebody else can't use that other number that's out there.
Well, it's interesting because we've treated social security numbers as passwords for
Yes.
years.
We have, which is
But-
wrong, because they're just out there, and they're not even encrypted a lot of places, and people used to have to write them on their checks, right, for grocery store.
Yeah.
Right.
So take it to a different level. Even though Equifax in Argentina was breached, we talked about admin, their DNI numbers are equivalent to our social security numbers. Those are public. They've treated social security numbers as the exact opposite, and the reason that they're public is because there are a lot of people with the same names, and it's a way of them refining that process already down. So maybe some of it is how we actually treat identities or social security numbers as not being private, but being more of a way to identify us. Just a thought.
DNI is.
It's something, it's in Spanish, it's the
It's
Argentinian
taxing.
equivalent of our social security
Got it.
number.
Okay. Okay. So you think that's a game changer just because of the breadth and the scope and the value of the data that was compromised?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I do too.
It's going to be, it's probably been on the dark net for some time. It's amazing the information you find on the dark net.
Yeah.
And you can find pretty much a lot of people's emails, passwords, and those are just the starting point for a much bigger attack. And now you add in their social security number. Health institutions have been a real target over the last few years
Right.
because of all the information that they store.
Right.
And now you couple that with now all the credit monitoring information. And I'm, by the way, in the process of buying a home.
Yeah.
So I can't freeze my credit or do anything because I'm getting ready to close on a home in less than a week.
You just gotta hang it out there.
But that data is out there, along with all my OPM data.
Yeah.
We're amazed. You know, we saw an incident where it was very clear someone was doing credential stuffing against our websites. What credential stuffing is where they've taken a list off the dark net of IDs and passwords, and they just they go to any website. It's not necessarily, has nothing to do
Could
with
be
Charter
Charter.
per se.
Yeah.
They just find websites that require IDs and passwords, and they start pumping them into they run a script, pump in the IDs and passwords just to find one
Just
that
to
might
find
work.
a hit.
And then, okay, now I've got this piece of intel. I can now get into Charter's website. Now I can get into Yeah, now I can get into Amazon's website. Oh, maybe I could buy something on Amazon. Maybe I could go in there and change their profile and have it shipped to me in Argentina.
You
One
know,
click.
Yeah,
I-
with
Exact
one
thing's
click,
already
the,
happened with
the
Tom,
Amazon.
state
Tom, I'll
payment
ask you, as
there.
I hear this, and it's honestly very discouraging. I mean, and maybe asking the question, are we winning or are the bad guys winning, is the wrong question. I mean, but are we winning or are the bad guys winning? I mean,
I think we are winning. As a product manager, one of my favorite parts of the job is going out and talking to customers and finding out their use cases. But it can also be one of the more frustrating parts, because in a lot of cases I'll have requests for our product to do certain things that we already do, and
Okay.
it comes down to the
Yeah.
education side of it. I think from a tool perspective, we are winning when we start moving into this more predictive or analytical side
Absolutely.
of it.
okay.
The tool itself to manage identities is the great foundation, and identity is absolutely the foundation. But giving you the governance and the intelligence to analyze the identities and what they're actually doing,
Right.
that makes you much more able to respond to these attacks that we know are going to happen.
An example of that sort of behavioral analysis would be what?
Well, so there's great examples. The credential stuffing, right? I mean, that's one thing. You start
Okay.
seeing a whole bunch of data popping up on your website.
That's weird.
Identities being created. Yeah, you
Right.
can
That's
actually see,
weird.
and you've got policies defined that
Okay.
talk about these identities and how they're being created, so you can actually see these identities. That's
Yeah.
anomalous.
Right.
from-
Would that fall into the category of like Google will tell me I've signed in from a new device? Or
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
right,
yeah,
right.
absolutely,
That's a
yeah.
great,
Absolutely.
I think, a
Absolutely.
recognizable example. Jim, what's your view? Fatigue and impossibility, or is there a light at the end of this tunnel?
Oh, well, I'm a pessimist because I'm a security engineer. I'm forced to play defense.
Yes,
I can't
I get
really
it.
go out and attack the people who are attacking me. That's not legal, and I've chosen to work within that boundary.
Okay.
So let's start there.
Okay.
Can I win? No, I can't win
Mhm.
in that traditional definition of the word.
Yeah.
Can I keep up? Yes. And as long as you are doing the good basic stuff, you can keep up and you can prevent catastrophe. And that's what I shoot for.
Okay.
Right? You can't say, you know
Okay.
what, I am immune. No one will ever hack me again.
Right.
That's not going to happen. I think we all are that's not realistic. When I look at the staff I have versus the staff
Right.
that I'm facing,
Right.
okay, I'm a company. I don't care which company. I'm a company. I have a limited number of staff, and I'm
Mhm.
facing the world. So, okay, 7 billion people are against me, minus my maybe 10,000.
Yeah.
Great.
Go get 'em, team.
I think that's
yeah.
an important differentiation. I would tend to agree that I think winning is keeping up
Okay.
and being able to respond quickly and hopefully mitigating the damage before it grows to an
Yeah.
epitax level.
David, from what's rewarding about the craft and the profession and the job and the science that's behind it? I mean, is it a sense of doing just that, being a protective agent out there? Is that part of it?
Well, my job is not necessarily implementation.
Yeah.
My job is to try to translate and inform, like he was saying about tools that do things and customers don't know they do them. Like, for example, I would be shocked to hear that Beyond Trust doesn't have the same capability, but both of our companies, I'm sure, have a sniffing capability to find the privileged accounts everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And, you may own the product that does that,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't know that feature's in
I
there.
got you.
My
Yeah.
job is to
Yeah.
say, look, step one is inventorying. Step one is figuring out where all the over-credentialed identities are, right? And
Yeah.
finding all the privileged accounts that maybe you have lost track of.
Right.
And at that point, you can start doing something about it and playing catch-up.
You talked, Mary, in our pre-call about the relationship between the vendor community and I still call you guys MSOs because I date myself, but the cable industry. And where do you see areas in which innovation can be supported or enriched or brought to bear and to prosper within your organization? How do you deal with that?
We really now, historically, a lot of our technologies have been focused on detections. And the
Okay.
reality is detection is too late. That means something bad has already
That's a
happened.
great line, right?
And so what we're really trying to drive our vendors from an innovation standpoint is how can you help me be proactive and preventative? You've heard the term quite a few times now about anomaly detection.
Yeah.
We are now becoming mature enough as a security profession that we're very much becoming much like the insurance industry, The insurance industry has all these mortuary charts, right? They know when the average person's going to die. They have tons and tons of years of data. We're starting to get that maturity too from a security standpoint. And we're able to, now we kind of understand the typical behaviors a bad actor follows. And we're taking those bad actors, or the vendors are taking those bad actor behaviors and turning it into machine learning. So that when they start to see that this file gets downloaded and all of a sudden you see an action that shows the file is starting to be executed, that's anomalous behavior.
Okay.
So how can we stop that
Okay.
before the bad thing happens? So we're really trying to help drive the vendors to think about what are the proactive preventative solutions.
Right.
For the last probably 3 years, it's been all about threat intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, threat intelligence are really just indicators of compromise that you can then bump up against your environment to see if, in fact, you've been compromised too. So the word threat intelligence isn't what most people thought it was.
Not a predictive necessarily.
It wasn't the predictiveness.
approach.
So now we're seeing the vendors really, really focusing on how can we use that behavior pattern, how can we detect the anomalies, whether it's through authentication and authorization, and that's not right, they're logging in from the wrong place, or they're logging in from too
Multiple
many
locations.
places,
Uh-huh.
down to the network layer and the network traffic. We've never seen that traffic before. Let's take that traffic over and quarantine it for a few seconds
Okay.
just to see what that traffic is going to do
Interesting.
before we deliver it on into the customer.
Okay.
So we really are moving to that proactive. I have a mantra right now with my team of I really don't want to look at new products unless it can help me automate, because there's no way I can get enough cybersecurity
Right.
professionals
Right.
to defend against
To
all
Jim's
this.
point, right.
How can it bring machine learning?
Mm-hmm.
You know, why do I have to have a human do that? How can machine learning help me do that?
Yeah.
And can artificial intelligence be there? A lot of the vendors use the AI word. Oh, our solution has artificial intelligence, but most of it's really machine learning. But we really have, I think, in the last couple of years made some strides around that proactive, preventative.
That sounds
through
encouraging.
anomalies.
I mean, is that an
Anomalies.
area of investment and focus for you guys?
Well, I
At
just say, I
Novacoast?
think that's what makes me hopeful. I'm not as pessimistic as Jim.
It's because I'm the engineer.
Yeah.
Because he has to actually do the work, right? But I think to your point earlier about knowing the culture of a company when you come in and them having a security minded focus, that's becoming much more prevalent. So I think over time we'll just have fewer and fewer softer targets.
Okay.
It'll be
Okay.
harder and harder for the bad actors
And I
to
think
find.
I think it's also incumbent upon vendors,
Mhm.
vendors in the room and all throughout the space, to remember the lesson of Target, which was that false positives are perhaps the thing that we need to start defeating.
Okay.
Because there was a 10 or 12-day backlog on security incidents, threat profiled incidents, right, that they were trying to make their way through until they finally came to the one that was actually indicative of the contractors that had gotten in. And in those 12 days of churning through false positives,
Right.
we all know what happened, right, that Christmas, right? So
Yeah.
the number of false positives has to go down.
Do
And
you-
that's where machine learning, that's where artificial intelligence, I think, can make a big impact.
Yeah, and I want to add to the machine learning piece too, because Comcast is spending a lot of time and energy on that. We have a machine learning guild. And so we have all the technologists and engineers that are working on machine learning get together and talk about what
Neat,
we're
yeah.
doing, right?
Yeah.
You know, picking where we should be focusing our time to get the right traction in the right areas, building on data analytics to get to that predictive model you're talking about, Mary, because if we're not able to predict, right, then we're not going to be able to prevent. And that's really the key, is as the bad guys keep getting more vigilant, right, more organized, there's more of them, right, because they're getting paid more reward, more people are going into that business, and the
That's an
scale
industry
with which
in and of itself.
that's
Right.
right,
It is.
it is, and the scale with which they're able to be successful is much greater than what it used to be, that we have to embrace machine learning. Excuse me, we have to embrace cloud, we have to embrace ways that our technologies can talk to each other easily, right, where we can have that broader view of what's actually happening with our services in our network.
As
Right.
a vendor, we know our data the best. We know our internals the best. and to the machine learning concepts, I think it's up to the individual vendors to clean up the false positives, clean up their events, and then pump it into larger machine learning or analytic systems.
Okay.
Because if I send garbage out, the next step in processing is going to be garbage. But while we have a lot of promise in machine learning and threat analytics, I think the evolution is not going to stop there. We see standards like OpenDXL and Splunk Adaptive Response that are taking that machine learning output and doing automated actions and then going to the human afterwards and going, I did this action because these all correlated events came from all my different sensors and sources, and it was 3 a.m. Did I do the right thing?
Okay, and in your industry, guys, what's driving the ability to make those investments? This is a growth industry, right? I presume. I mean,
Oh,
Paul, maybe
absolutely.
you
absolutely.
could address that. Yeah.
Yeah, and there wasn't this focus. I mean, our company started coming up on 21 years ago, and there was no security practices
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah.
We saw the advent of the identity management industry come and did really well there, but now it's really all security focused.
I wanted to offer an invitation to our two cable industry representatives. Are there any discussion points we haven't touched on that you would like to bring to or to elevate to an audience of this is your chance, like to stake the claim for greater budgets, greater investment, greater support, but what haven't we talked about that's meaningful in this category? I'll start,
I mean,
Nancy,
you
with
talk
you.
about budgets and support. We certainly have, those discussion points that we could talk about. But I think the bigger picture really is, something Mary touched on, which is, executive support, right? And we have that at
Culture.
Comcast, right? It's the culture. So build it in. Don't bolt it on. It's everyone's responsibility, not just the security team. The security team's leading, the security team's supporting, but everybody's responsible, right? And making sure that it's part of that. And, I didn't talk about our crown jewel, right? So, where you talked about services, which is important, but that's
Right.
kind of table stakes because lots of people can provide internet or lots of
Can
companies
sort
can
of
provide internet
replicate some of
service.
what you do.
Yeah, sort
Yeah.
of replicate. It's our customer experience, right? That's our crown jewel. And security should be an enabler. Security should enable a better customer experience. Instead of remembering a password, you should be able to log in with a yes, no, or a fingerprint, or a facial recognition, or a voice, right? In combination
Right.
with maybe some other things like you've registered your device with Comcast, right? And it's listed on your account, and you can see
Yeah.
that, right? So it's your phone, not somebody else's phone trying to get into your account.
I'm all for that as a customer, right?
And let's not forget that the Internet of Things brings an even wider
That's
trust
right.
network
Absolutely.
amongst devices. So you can
Yeah,
ask
that's what I was
to
thinking.
go to your thermostat and set it momentarily to 70
Right.
as a way of logging into a system, as I kind of envision it. All those devices are trusted by me and therefore by the systems I'm trying to get into.
That's right, and security should add to the customer experience.
Right.
Security should really be transparent.
Yeah.
In most cases, customers shouldn't have to worry
That would
about
be
it.
nice.
They shouldn't have to know about it.
Well, that's the optimal level. Right?
It
I
is
mean,
the
you want to make
optimal level.
access with the trust behind it, and
That's right.
it's transparent to the users, your customers. Yeah.
Exactly, and a bunch of the risk-based authentication, that's what it is, about building trust with our customers without bothering them, because we know they're in their house, so why should they have to log in if they're in their own
Yeah.
house?
Yeah.
Well, Mary, what have we missed? What have we didn't talk
Well,
about?
I think Nancy did a great job kind of summarizing what my thoughts were as well. Just to kind of add on to that, when we talk about making security everybody's responsibility, in a large Fortune 100 company, that takes a lot of time to turn that
Sure.
tide. And, just echoing that message and making sure that message is coming from the top down. And it's being sent to our vendors as well. I can't tell you how many vendors have come to us and I've said, that's not acceptable, we can't put it in our network because it's got the vulnerabilities. Well, your peer company didn't say anything about that. I don't care about my peer
Right.
company, I care about this company.
Right.
And setting what's considered tolerant and what's not tolerant. But it does begin with the top. I'm very blessed that I've got upper leadership that really does support security. They don't want our name in the paper.
They do not.
And they really do try to support and continue to invest in the latest and greatest technologies. We're not going to be able to stop this, and I think they recognize that. I've met some executives in my past who say, can you just make this problem go away? It's not a problem that's going to go away.
No.
And just like Nancy was saying, we have to build it into everything we do. And helping change the employee's view of security is just a checklist item or a roadblock to this is something I need to think about throughout whatever I'm doing. that's the most important message.
Let's do, close it out with 30 seconds each or whatever you want to take, starting with Nancy. What's fun about your job? What do you like?
Oh, I love the new things that we're always doing. We're always breaking the edge. AWS, we do a lot of stuff in AWS, and Amazon always tells us we're breaking their stuff because we're always pushing
Go
the
Comcast, right.
envelope, right? Machine learning,
Yeah.
we're pushing the envelope. We're doing really cool stuff. And Comcast is so innovative. They want each of the teams, with whatever they're working on, to do the things they need to do something that's going to really work long term, not short term. Like, you don't have to be boxed in with a certain set of tools,
Right.
technologies, programming languages.
It's a
You need-
liberated way of
it's
thinking in a way.
liberating,
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah.
So that's really what's fun about my job. And my particular team actually deals with hundreds of different teams every single year.
I'm sure you do, yeah.
Because we do the security architecture across Comcast. So I get to play with and see all these different things. So that's super fun.
Maury and Beyond Trust, what's fun?
Every day is a learning experience.
Yeah.
There's always a new challenge. There's always something new in the news. I'm always experiencing a new type of threat, problem, or even technology to try to address or tackle. I have to say that if I was an average security professional, which is part of the employee problem, I think we all recognize, doing a mundane task every day, I wouldn't be in the security
Not
space.
so much, yeah.
No. There's always a challenge. And you wake up in the morning, you see something new in the paper, or you hear about something else, and you have a deep sigh. I feel sorry for that person or that company. And then you go, okay, how can I make the world better?
So running a company is not an easy profession, Paul. You have chosen it. What gets you up in the morning? What's fun about
Oh, I
Novacoast?
just love the interaction with the brilliant people that I get to work with. We're, as we talked about on a pre-call, I think a lot of us hire a lot out of universities, and just having this young, vibrant talent that's coming through the door every day and the ideas that they bring to the table. It's awesome. I love kind of like what Maury's saying, having some insider knowledge on what's going on in the world that's making the headlines in the news as well. That's fun. The thing that worries me sometimes, I feel like I'm in the precursor to a Terminator movie, though, as the technology becomes more prevalent.
Yeah,
At some
well,
point, we're going to be doing battle against the
Put
technology.
that on your 5-year plan. Mary from Charter Communications.
There's a lot of things. So the thing I think my team really gets most excited about is people who are in security love the constant change and threat. And we get really energized when we see that a new threat is trying to get into one of our systems and we've blocked it.
Yeah.
There's like a cheer that goes, oh yeah, this detected it and we stopped it from happening. And the team gets really, really excited. So looking at the new innovative technologies, how can we embrace the innovative technologies, pushing the button? You know, as a Fortune 100 company, we tend to be a little bit further beyond where most companies can be. And knowing that we're actually preventing something bad from happening. WannaCry was a great example. When WannaCry came out, it was kind of like, that's not going to really impact us or our customers, because we'd already put so many proactive things in place that it really was just a blurb for us. And so we already had those defenses. So when something bad does happen, we always do a root cause analysis. Like we're understanding what happened to Equifax. When HBO happened, we were on the phone with HBO. Tell us exactly what happened to make sure it couldn't happen to us. And then recognizing, oh, yep, we've already got those controls in place.
Okay.
So knowing when we're being proactive and being preventative, and knowing that we've got leadership that's supporting us when we say, hey, listen, I know this is going to be a pain, but I need to have all the ACLs revised because now I don't want this type of traffic coming into our
but
network
it's
anymore.
important, right.
And they say, yeah, go do it.
Okay.
And then something bad happens a year later, and it's like, yeah, because we put that ACL in, we don't even look at that kind of traffic anymore. That's exciting.
It is, and I think it's the cutting edge nature of what you guys are all involved in is really apparent in this conversation. Tom from Micro Focus, what jazzes you about your profession?
I absolutely love my job. I've been working in the identity access and security products for 20 years now, and I would say the biggest thing, and it's going to echo some of the statements that have already been made, is just that it is ever changing, it is constantly challenging. But ultimately, the best thing I like about my job is dealing with our customers and partners and learning from them. Because honestly, I can do a whole bunch of studying and look at and try and be proactive about what's going to come in the future. But our customers are on the cutting edge of that, and our partners are on the cutting edge of that. And working with them and understanding from them and learning and growing together is the most pleasurable part of my job. There's a quote downstairs on the wall that I'm going to butcher a little bit, but basically said the cable can do a great number of things, but when we work together, it's really unlimited, right? I mean,
One of the many inspiring lines at the Cable Center. Our resident pessimist, Jim from Novacoast, what do you like?
So I'm going to echo the same sentiment, right? I mean, as an engineer by training, I love a challenge, and security is me playing chess or Strategio or Risk or video games or whatever against 6 billion people, right? So it's always something new and fresh coming at me, and I have to think and be, constantly exercising the gray matter. So.
And then David from Micro Focus, round us out. What about you? What's inspiring or innovating about your work?
I actually don't really like my work.
That's okay, then that'll close it out.
Just
No.
kidding. No, to try not to echo what I've heard before, but it's all of these things, and also in my role as a kind of a translator between functionalities and needs. I think one of my favorite parts of my job is reading Tom's release notes and other product managers' release notes and spotting that little nugget in there that I remember 3 or 4 customers actually asking about and felt they were stuck and couldn't move forward on their path towards secure governance unless they had that, and getting back to them and letting them know
Here
that
it is.
the door is now open and they can actually now go that step.
I can tell you guys what I love about my job is getting to talk in detail to really smart people about interesting subjects, and I've been privileged to do so over the last 90 minutes. I really, again, want to thank Novacoast, Beyond Trust, and Micro Focus for making this event possible and inviting me to be part of it. To Nancy and Mary from the cable industry, thanks for, you guys are busy people, and thanks for taking your time, and to the good folks at the Cable Center. This is a great place to do a panel, and hopefully we can do it again. Signing off, I'm Stuart Schley.